So hello, everyone. Welcome to our second session of the Computing Research Association's graduate school application preparation workshops as part of their undergraduate research to PhD program. I'm Dr. Karen Arcos, and I'll be co-facilitating today's workshop with Dr. Dan Gardner. And we're also joined by CRA staff. Her name is Iniola, I believe, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. If not, feel free to let me know. So just so everyone is aware, this workshop will be recorded in order to be able to make it available post our session today. We'll be making it available on YouTube, so we're just putting that out there from the very beginning so that if anyone is uncomfortable, you can feel free to mute yourself as well as turn off your camera if you're uncomfortable being on video. So today's workshop will be covering the topics, two main topics, and they are identifying your research interests as well as identifying potential graduate schools and programs. So just to give a very brief review of what we covered during session 1 last week, we covered the topics shown here, which is that you learned, those who participated learned a bit more about our journeys to graduate school, about Dan's journey, about my journey to graduate school. We also we refined your understanding of what it's like to be a PhD student. What does that involve? We also discussed some of the different personal as well as practical and structural shifts that take place when you're starting out in a PhD program. We compared the pros and cons of pursuing a PhD at different times and in different institutions. And we also gave you all a better sense of what you can expect during upcoming future workshops. And for anyone who missed last week's session or would like to review it, the recording link is provided here on the slide. So you can feel free to watch that recording as well. So to give you all a better overview of what you'll gain from attending our session today, after today's session, you'll be able to identify and list your research interests as well as search for different schools and programs based off of your interests. So those are the two main areas that we'll be covering, as well as identifying your research interests, which I forgot to mention. So we'd like to start out with a bit of an interactive activity. So we'd like to ask you all to take a moment. Last week, we gave you all some questions to think about in terms of programs that you're interested in applying to. So we'd like for you all to take a moment to please think about your answers to these questions that we have shown here. And the questions are, what are some schools or programs that you're interested in applying to? As well as what are some of the different things at these schools or at these programs? What do they have that draw your interest to apply to these programs? And I'll give you all a moment to think about your answers. And if you're willing to share, if you would please raise your hand using the raise hand feature on Zoom, or put a response in the chat, that would be super helpful, just so that we can get a little bit of discussion going. So I'm not seeing anything in the chat. If anyone would like to speak, feel free to unmute. Oh, okay, so child psychology, that's a great interest. The workshops are focused on computing PhD programs, but a lot of what we'll be covering in terms of applications applies to applications in psychology as well.
And also, if you're considering sort of human-computer interaction or informatics programs, there's a lot of opportunities for combining uh, an emphasis on child welfare and child psychology with sort of how that sort of intersects with computing in a broad sense as well. So I don't want you to think that you can also really sort of apply it directly depending on your specific interests with um, clinical. Well, so we have a couple psychology folks. That's interesting. So
That's
yeah,
awesome because I shared it with psych folks, so it's good to see some psych
yeah,
represented. For those who
we're
don't know, I'm in neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, so.
yeah.
And we have a couple of people who raised their hand. Kyla, I saw yours first, so.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I had my hand raised. I'm interested in social cognition, so also a psychology person, and I'm really interested in looking at grad school programs that are out of the United States. So if there's any information about that, I'd be interested in hearing it.
Um, So the out of the United States focus, because of the nature of the CRA, the primary focus of the workshop is in state. That means, that being said, if you have specific questions, we're happy to try to answer them. Um, if you'd like to as well after the workshop, if you want to reach out, I did my PhD in the US, but I now currently work in an institution outside of the US, so I'm happy to sort of answer other specific questions you might have. We do have to primarily focus on U.S. institutions during the workshop, though, however, even though, again, we can answer some specific questions. Um, the and there are a lot of similarities in terms of how to prioritize certain things as well. Oh, I also see that you posted in the chat that you're interested in Rutgers and Baylor for partial or fully covered tuition costs. In the US, actually, it's really common for almost all PhD programs to be partially or fully funded. Um, that's a fairly common, in part because of how much many of the research institutions that have PhD programs rely on PhD students to, we talked about this a little bit last week, rely a lot on sort of PhD student labor to help teach classes or conduct research activities. And so it's actually really, really common, if not essential, for a lot of those institutions to fund and pay their PhD students. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about maybe some other factors you might think about to look up some other institutions. But yeah,
And in addition to what Dan's mentioned, there's also a lot of different fellowships that you can apply to help cover the tuition costs of attending programs in the US as well.
yeah, they go above and beyond the sort of basic funding.
So clinical psych, other clinical, wow, interesting.
Yeah, so a lot of social cognition. I see there's two Kyla Spencers with that are different colors. Is that a coincidence or just friends? Um, yeah, yeah, you just yeah, exactly. It's kind of funny. Um, yeah, I
Different,
mean, there's
wow, interesting.
different people. That's what a coincidence.
Yeah, seriously.
Um, Yeah, I mean, so again, our focus and today is computing. However, I don't think that should be a deterrent for anyone. There are a lot of
Mm-mm.
intersections of psychology broadly and sort of adjacent fields and computing. Um, yeah, I mean, in my program that I did in informatics, there was a lot of folks doing sort of very psych. In fact, one of my biggest collaborators was a clinical psychologist for 20 years before they did their PhD. They did their PhD in an information and computer science school. They are now working in an engineering school doing computing-based psych interventions. So, I mean, there's a lot of really sort of a lot of opportunities for that at that intersection. Um, Karen, did we
For
want to
sure.
maybe,
Okay. I
did
was
we
gonna
want to
say we
go?
should transition to the other part of this activity.
Absolutely. Yep.
Um, so a lot, it's great. Thank you so much for those who have participated. It's really great to have some participation from you all, and we hope to continue that throughout today's session. That being said, we've talked a little bit about schools, about types of programs that you can apply to, and in addition to that, that's all important information to keep in mind. It's also important to consider who does the research that you're interested in conducting. So, and how well you get along with that person being your academic advisor. So who is who your academic advisor is will influence, and how well you get along with them will influence the type of research that you do, how you conduct the research, productivity. There's a lot of reasons to really take some time to really think about not only the school and the program, but who in the school or the program is that you're interested in conducting research with. So we thought, Dan and I figured we would share a little bit about our stories in terms of how we found our advisors. So in my case, like I mentioned before, I earned my PhD in cognitive neuroscience from University of California, Irvine. And when I was starting out in terms of searching for advisors, I started my search in terms of schools and programs. So I took geography into account. I'm in Southern California. I wanted to stay in Southern California. So I identified some schools and that fit that criteria, that had the programs I was interested in. And I started listing out faculty at the different campuses. And eventually, after making this list, I emailed the faculty members, heard back from a couple. I mean, some were straight up not taking any students. My advisor in the end, she was very, very welcoming. She said, I mean, your research is very, and I'll tell you all right now, the research that she did it was visual cognition work, visual perception work, and neuroimaging. And I was really interested at the time in doing more reading comprehension type research in individuals who are sighted and in those who are blind. So our research interests somewhat were related in that, I mean, we're interested in the brains, how we take in information, but there was not as much overlap. And she said that to me in the very beginning. She said, I mean, your research sounds very insightful. It's not related to what I do, but I'm interested in exploring that with you. And so we ended up having a conversation about the work, and she was the one and only advisor who took me in terms of an advisee. That was the only PhD program that I got accepted into. So that's just a little brief anecdote about my case, and I'll pass it to Dan to share more about his story.
Yeah, I'll keep it pretty brief in part because I'll probably talk a little bit more about it later as we talk about some processes for identifying schools. But I think so there's two parts to this, identifying the school and identifying the advisor, and then sometimes those can be the same sort of journey. And for me, they sort of were and sort of weren't. I did identify one of my eventual advisors. I was co-advised through a method I'll talk about some more, which is just sort of the research I was looking into doing. She was a person who was doing some very sort of cool research in that domain. And that led me to, I also coincidentally did my PhD, like the two Kyla's, I also did my PhD at UC Irvine, although in a different department, a different part of the school. Um, and at a different time, Karen and I never met. Uh,
No.
but funny coincidence there. But yeah, I found my advisor in the University of California because of the research I was wanting to look at. I found the woman who eventually became one of my advisors, although at first she also was not taking students. So I didn't think she was going to be my advisor. It sort of worked out coincidentally. But I found University of California, Irvine because, and I mentioned this for those who were in the session last week, I had a bit of a weird long journey. It took me 3 years to get into a PhD program. But by the third year, I'd sort of realized that there wasn't another university in the world really that had more people, not just in the department that I was looking at doing my PhD in, but across campus. There wasn't another university that had more sort of people that were proximal to the kind of research that I wanted to do than Irvine. So it became a sort of it's just like, oh, well, this is the sort of the best place to do the kind of thing that I want to do. It makes it very easy for me to tell the story about why I should do it there, which is something again we'll get into later, but also in the coming weeks. Um, but yeah, that was essentially, it's just like there was just too many people there to work with. It was a smorgasbord of options.
So now we'll be sharing a bit more about how to identify and list out your research interests. So on this slide where we have three different topics that we're covering. It's a research topic, a research area, and a research question. And coming up with a research interest has those broad steps that I just mentioned. So I'm assuming you all probably took some sort of research methods class by now, but just to briefly summarize this content, a topic is more relating to the subject that you're interested in studying, in learning more about. So what problem, another way to think of it is like, what problem are you facing, or what challenge are you facing that you're trying to learn more about? Whereas the research area is more the field that that topic or that problem or challenge falls under. And the research question, it more revolves around the idea of how do you solve the problem that you're trying to address? Or how do you solve the problem? How do you address the challenge, depending on how you'd like to frame the question? So here on this slide, we're giving you just a brief example of a research area, a topic, and a question. So for example, sticking to our focus on computing, one of the research areas in computing is robotics. And within robotics, that's the broader field. Within robotics, someone might be interested in studying something like, for example, autonomous cars in the city. That could be somebody's particular research topic. And the question could be something along the lines of what we have here, which is how can we make autonomous cars more effective in the context of humans who are crossing the road? However, it's important to keep in mind that the questions that you're asking, they might shift as you continue your research study. In my case, I was interested in reading comprehension, then I went into memory research. So it's really important to view your application, for those that are applying now or down the line, view your application as your current area as well as your current topic or your current question that you are most interested in. Don't think that these are like one and all decisions, hard decisions that you can't change along the way. You can definitely change them down the line.
And we'll talk more about that in the next couple sessions as we get to like sort of framing your application for sure.
And something else to keep in mind here as well is that the research question that we posed here as an example, it can still be more specific than that. We can focus it more on the software side of things. If we want to ask something like, how do we change a machine learning logic model, and how would that change influence how a vehicle interprets sensor data, for example, or a spontaneous pedestrian crossing the street? Or if you're interested more in a hardware focused type of idea, then you might be interested more in like sensor configurations and how they could improve the quality of data, or the software that the software that you're using interprets. Or if you're interested in this from civil engineering, that's another take on the question. So how could like additional road features possibly decrease the risk of pedestrians crossing to begin with? So that's just a couple different takes on the very same question. The point here is that depending on the field, the question is going to shift. And feel free, Dan, if you want to chime in.
No, I think those
Okay,
one
awesome.
that's perfect.
Cool. So now we'd like to take a moment to just brainstorm a couple brainstorm an example together, just so that you all can get a sense of how we can come up with a research area, a topic, and a question. So to start out, feel free again, if anyone would like to raise your hand and unmute or put in the chat. Where would you start if you're trying to think of a research area?
Or if you can start at topic too, if you've got a
Or
specific
topic, yeah.
you want to, if you're like, what is it that you're hoping broadly or specifically? What is something you're thinking about or hoping to research as part of your PhD or potential PhD? Great. Robert's got a response.
So antimicrobial systems, that might be more of a topic, I'd say.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would definitely agree that. And so antimicrobial antimicrobial resistance hotspots around asphalt manufacture. No,
No, that was good. That was a good
that's good.
response. I was just trying
And
to categorize it.
And you just answered the next question, right? So you have a good topic, right? So you have the mid-level topic, which is, something to do with, in the same sense that in the previous example, we had autonomous vehicles in urban setting, right? You have identified a great topic, which is antimicrobial resistance hotspots around asphalt manufacture, which could be researched a number of different ways, but that's sort of a mid-level topic. And then you also identified the area, right? Which is could be, depending on how you're doing that, right? Biology or data science. And then you say you're already researching it. What could you provide the specific, if you don't have like an NDA or something, could you provide a specific example of sort of how you're studying antimicrobial resistance hotspots around asphalt manufacture?
Okay.
Uh,
So it's part
oh,
of
cool.
epidemiology. Nice.
Right. So you're probably looking at something to do. So you're looking, sorry, resistance hotspots. So you're probably measuring spread of these microbes sort of in contention with some sort of resistance mechanism. Oh, examining closure related to complaints and social factors. Interesting. Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple different ways you can search this, but your question then has to do with, oh wow, you're looking at all kinds of stuff related to cancer development and traits of case study. Interesting. Yeah. So I mean, depending on if you're looking at sort of tradition, if you were taking a traditional epidemiology approach rate, like this has to do with sort of the spread, you might be looking at that's I'm so asphalt manufacturer. So you're really looking at sort of probably like fumes and air quality. I didn't even think about that. Either way, right? You're looking at, yeah, perfect. Excellent. So, yeah, so you might be studying one way you could study that same topic, right, would be looking at the spread of microbes in the air. You could do that with sensors at different sort of radii, starting at the sort of epicenter of the production and out, just to sort of get some basic data about how it spreads in a particular area or with particular conditions or in relation to particular manufacture methods. You then sort of, as you pointed out, you could also look at the impacts of it, right? So one is the mechanism of the spread, or you might be studying when you're looking at these cases of cancer, you're studying the impact of it. So, right, that's another source of another form of data, another question. They become
And
related,
another
and they
field, just to
yeah, and
keep
another
popping.
field, right? Yeah,
Hmm.
so depending on how you end up, depending on which part of the phenomena of this manufacturer um, yeah, I can imagine. Depending on which sort of dimension of the phenomena becomes more interesting or that is perhaps least understood, helps you to sort of prioritize a question. And being able to sort of identify sort of these three levels and in particular what part of the question you're really interested in becomes really, really important as you begin to sort of decide who does it that I want to study, where do I want to study with, or what do I want to study, who do I want to study with, and where and beginning to tell the stories that we'll talk about in the coming sessions when it comes to actually application materials. Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great example. Does someone else want to share an example of something either they're already doing, like in his case, or that even is there somebody
A
who
future
maybe,
case?
I was just gonna say, is there somebody still trying to figure it out and maybe we can help you along a little bit? All right. Yeah. Kyla again put out social cognition as a research area. Yeah. Topic pro-social and antisocial behavior. Perfect. Yeah, that's a specific part of social cognition. And then research question, what neural processes are related to decision making that leads to antisocial behavior? Uh, no, I mean that you're right. That is still a little vague because if you're trying to do this as an experiment, right, you need to start defining, well, what sort of antisocial behaviors are we talking about? Um, what part of the neural sort of landscape are we looking at, or are we looking at it holistically? Um,
And who are
but
we looking at it in?
right, and
That's
who are we
another
looking
thing
at it
too.
in? Absolutely, yeah. So sure, but all you need to do to make it more specific is you start identifying your variables, right? And that's how you go from sort of the general research question that we had, right, to sort of like getting it more specific is just sort of including your variables within your question. So you take something like what neural processes are related to decision making that lead to antisocial behavior, and maybe what you're looking at as an antisocial behavior is toxicity of some sort, or
How a couple interacts with their kid, for example. There's
sure,
a lot of
right,
ways that you can take this.
but you so identify your antisocial behavior. Toxicity is a relatively easy one. It's sort of well studied right now. But you want to look at a particular community. On that again, an obvious sort of current one is maybe on a particular social media platform or across several social media platforms. And then you identify your subpopulation, right? So it could be students, for example. So what neural processes are related to decision making in students, leading to antisocial behavior on social media, for example. Now, that test is kind of weird because then you got to hook up neural monitors to them while they're using the social media. Maybe they don't want to do that. But again, in terms of like modeling how you sort of get this more specific, it works out as an exercise. Um, but yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can get more specific. Oh, and we have another
Oh,
one.
okay, we have another one. So
Great.
we'll do this
I'm
one and then move to the
Yeah, I was
next
gonna
slide.
say this will be the last one. Great, perfect. Yeah, Karen, did you want to take it
Let me go back to the chat now.
or it's cryptography if you want me to take it?
Sure.
Okay.
I can
Yeah,
pop in.
so yeah, research area cryptography, which, is you could also equally, depending on how big you wanted to go, that's a, part of computer science, of course, and math. So depending on which part of cryptography, but as you say, security, privacy, same thing, right? Topic, detecting illicit activity in decentralized finance networks. Ooh, yeah, and that, which is a big thing right now as more and more things go to blockchain. And research question, how effective existing machine learning methods are on different networks and asset types. Interesting. Okay. So yeah, I mean, this is one where you really start to be, again, you to get that from a more a sort of general question to a more specific one, but also to move it from a sort of quick uh, model test, which essentially is something you could do in fairly quickly and it doesn't have a lot of sort of impact, to something that's really sort of becomes a really valuable research question, is you're really sort of thinking about what sort of, not just, yeah, the networks is a really big one. The machine learning models is almost a sort of a smaller piece of this, but really sort of looking at like, do the machine do different forms of distribution? So are we going to maybe use a different models on certain forms of like cryptocurrencies, or are we also thinking there's increasingly sort of use of cryptography and decentralized networks just as a sort of basic security mechanism for new forms of firewall and intrusion detection? So you can really sort of look at sort of quantify or sort of including in some of the potential outcomes and different sorts of processes these are networks are used for to sort of elevate that question and sort of bring some specificity and really good variables. So yeah, that's an interesting and sort of timely topic and question that you're getting into there. So yeah, that's really cool.
And to
Um,
quickly there was one question around funding and research in terms of how do you approach funding? We're going to be covering that a little more in the future sessions in terms of applications and how you craft your applications. I'd say the quick
yeah.
answer that quickly give is wording really matters. How you phrase things and how you sell things to people really makes a difference in terms of how much funding you might get for a certain topic.
Yeah, and I would also say that another short answer to JJ's question is that as somebody who does some research that is, not always the easiest to fund in the best of times, um, and as a PhD student, that can be less of a concern because if the university is funding you, it may not be tied to the same kinds of funding that is controlled by whatever the current administration might be. Um, but it becomes the answer to that question, unfortunately, though, ultimately becomes case by case. There's an easy, overarching answer to that question. Yeah.
Thank you all
Happy
so
to,
much.
if you want to email offline, I just realized our emails aren't in this slide deck, but
That's true.
um, we can drop them in by the end of, and if you have questions that exceed this sort of topic, I'm happy to, or I'm sure we're both
Same.
happy to address those. But yeah, great.
Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about research topics and interests. So we'll be transitioning more to talking about how you find computing PhD programs in the first place.
Computing with quotes.
Right.
For some folks, but
That's true, yeah.
officially computing programs. But a lot of this will apply outside that.
Right. So in our case, since the focus is technically computing PhD programs, here we just list several different types of programs that you might be interested in considering. So, and just to keep, it's also important on when you're thinking about what programs to apply to, it's important to keep in mind that you think about what research you want to do and how you'd like to research the particular topic, as well as what technology you'd like to use to research that particular topic, because that's going to really influence the types of programs that you consider applying to. So, for example, if you're really interested in cybersecurity and you want to focus on it in terms of the technical side of it, you might be more interested in a computer science program that might be more fitting for you. Whereas if you're more interested in how the influence of humans affects the security of computing systems, you might instead, you're still looking at cybersecurity, but you might want to look at it more from an informatics program's perspective. So what you research and how really influences where you apply. And so this slide is really just giving you a big picture sense of the different overviews in computing specifically. And it's also important to note that for engineering, you might also find engineering areas covered outside of computer science disciplines, which is where we have it listed here, but it could also be found in other areas. The universities don't necessarily make it easy to, one area is not in one department. You might have to look in different departments to really fuse your interests together as they get developed. And it's also important to keep in mind that the fields that are listed here are not necessarily distinct. It's not just one field, like field 1, field 2, field 3. No, it's not one, it's not separate fields. There's different universities, different schools, different departments. They overlap in terms of the types of training that they offer in these areas and where that training is offered. And just a quick note, something we'll talk more about in future sessions, that computer programs could exist in one department, and how you get admitted is generally, it's really not coordinated. So a university's process can really be distinct, which means that you would need to apply to different departments within the university to meet your interests.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week,
For
specifically.
sure. So here, we go into more detail on the different types of areas that researchers who are in computing might go into, in terms of the research areas that they're interested in. So you can see different areas. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, computing education, databases. There's a lot of different areas mentioned here. And so I'm just curious if you all again would take a moment to either unmute or share in the chat. What are your interests and where do they fit on the list? Are they mentioned on this list, or if they're not mentioned on this, are there any that you have that might not necessarily be included on the list?
And while you type that, I'm annoyed that while we have security, we didn't add cryptography. I should have thought of that, given some of the interests that were spread. And we also don't have anything that sort of links to psychology, but it's totally there. So yeah. Cryptography is often security, but actually there are elements of cryptography that are actually used for other means, but it is at its core, it's a security technology for sure.
So cryptography is one interest that it's good to know.
Yeah.
Like not
Yeah.
that's our point. This list is not mutually exclusive. That's not our goal
No.
here. We have
It's
there's a lot of areas we could cover.
Yeah, we would if we put all the topics you could cover at a PhD, especially even in a computing t PhD, you wouldn't be able to read the font, uh, essentially. So this list is meant to be big, but not exhaustive, and just to sort of as a inspiration for like, oh, like actually we can do a lot of things. So yeah. All right.
Sure, I'll
So
pass it
yeah,
to Dan.
yeah, so we're gonna switch gears once more as well. So now we started with sort of just trying to reflect and think about like what our own sort of interests are in terms of the kind of research we want to do, the kind of work we want to do. Then sort of, okay, so how do we think about where that research fits into a school? But this is more about like how do you actually sort of find some of the schools in the first place and decide on a particular program or department? Um, there's a couple ways of doing this or a couple dimensions of this. Next slide, please. So, sort of to the previous slide, right? Computing programs are often in a computing school or an information computer school or computing and engineering school. Sometimes I have a colleague that I'm writing with now where it's in the communications school. So they can be kind of all over the place. Um, and uh, different, especially based on the sort of topic that that program may specialize in. So sometimes programs have very sort of heavy specialization in a particular topic, especially smaller programs. So they might not sort of live on their own, and that's okay depending on, especially if you're interested in that very specialized topic, a smaller department like that might be the perfect place for you. But it's really just sort of another encouragement and reinforcement to sort of look broadly in terms of where you think you might want to do your computing or semi-computing related uh, um, research, right? We have some examples of some well-known computing programs, but this is again, nowhere near exhaustive. But these are just some big ones that you might, that can give you an idea of a sort of big, successful, diverse sort of research agenda program. But yeah, other than that, we can go to the next slide. And while you switch that also, Natalie, thanks for having you. Thanks for being here. Hopefully you got something out of it. Maybe we'll see you next week. Um, Another way to sort of look for schools, this is a sort of this might be familiar to like how you looked for undergraduate programs, for example. Is essentially just, rankings that you might find online. There's a lot of different ways that these programs are ranked, and a lot of sites that do that ranking that all have their own criteria. So, I mean, this is a good place to start because it sort of just gives you an overview of a lot of programs that have different forms of impact. Sorry, I'm wrestling with a cat right now who's trying to take away my computer. Um, but yeah, essentially, yeah, you can find these different rankings. They have different some independent measure of quality or impact in broader context, and it can be useful because to some of the questions that were asked in chat, for example, higher ranked universities are likely to have more resources for you as a PhD student. Whereas universities that maybe are fairly low are perhaps more likely to have fewer resources that are available to you. It doesn't necessarily mean that one is inherently better than the other for whatever it is you want to do, but it can sort of have impact on your experience and your priorities. Um, some would define finding programs this way as a top-down approach. Essentially, you're looking at sort of systematic reasoning before you sort of look at your specific reasoning, sort of that you maybe grow from yourself. But that's okay. It takes multiple form or multiple processes, and we'll talk about another one as well. So if we go to next slide. And so, sort of in opposition to a top-down approach is, of course, perhaps a what might be called a bottom-up approach, which is instead of starting with the universities and sort of institution-wide, you start with yourself, right? What is it that you're really looking into? Uh, um, Once you have that identified, who are some of the people who are doing really interesting work in that area? Like, what is the article that you read that made you really sort of have that aha moment that this is the kind of thing you want to do? Well, where do they work, right? Look them up, find what their department is like. Is it a department that has a PhD program? Are they accepting PhD programs, that sort of thing? How many
PhD
other people?
students, if
What
they're
did I say?
accepting PhD students.
What
No,
did I
this
say?
PhD programs.
Oh yeah, that would be weird. But are there other folks in their department that are also doing cool research that might be related to something you want to do, right? And if the answer is that there's a lot of people doing really cool stuff, then that might be a really good program for you. Um, So yeah, you're working backward from people you may already know from stuff you read in your undergrad or in your independent research, and you're using that as to work backward to find the programs that you want to look at. You can also look at uh, if you look at sort of their co-authors or people that they cite or that cite them, because that can continue to find other institutions sort of start to sort of, you know, as like a web to find out other institutions that way. Um, Now, Anthony asked the question of is the bottom-up approach more effective if you think your area interest is niche? Yeah, if you have a particularly niche project, it's probably the most effective way because if it's the highest ranked universities, weirdly, they tend to focus on fairly mainstream topics, right? It doesn't mean there isn't a niche person or people at those universities, but the stuff you're going to see sort of bubble to the top of information about those universities is likely the stuff that's more mainstream. So if you have a very sort of, I had a, uh, I had a colleague at UCI who was studying sort of how magic systems intersect with computing systems and sort of the logics that we use to sort of develop and design for them, which is a very niche topic. But he's at the sort of high-rated, computing program. But he got there very much from a bottom-up approach. He probably would have never found his advisor if he had taken a top-down approach. So yeah, that's a great question. Can we go to the next slide? Another thing is as you're finding these people, particularly when you're doing so with a bottom-up approach, you also do need to look at sort of what sort of faculty they are, because not only do you need to first see does this person even work at a university with a PhD program, because not every university does. All right, if they happen to work at a smaller, liberal arts college, for example, they are unlikely to be able to take PhD students. But even at like a large research institution, which are generally where you get your PhDs, you tend to have sort of two high-level categories of faculty. You have sort of tenure track faculty. These are people with job titles such as assistant professor, associate professor, full professor. And those are the folks who typically advise PhD students who take in PhD students to work on either their own research or the research that you propose. These are also the folks who tend to serve on admissions committees, which is important for upcoming weeks. Um, but they also have other faculty at these institutions, teaching professors, lecturers. In the U.S., lecturers means people who essentially don't do research; they only have teaching responsibilities, and other forms of instructors. You also have research scientists, research professors, postdoctoral scholars, and emeritus professors, which is just the fancy way of saying they're retired or semi-retired. And these people generally can't take PhD students, even though they may work in a program that grants PhDs. They cannot generally structurally accept PhD students of their own, in which case, if that's the person you want to work with, unless there's someone else in the department that can serve as a primary advisor, it's unlikely that you would be able to work with them as a sort of immediate advisor relationship. However, as it says, they can often work as co-advisors or just be on a committee. So yeah, so that's just something else to take in mind is that the person you really want to work with is in one of those sort of red category, second category, non-tenure track faculty. They are unlikely to serve as an advisor, so that should influence your choice. All right, next slide.
And just quickly before we go to the next slide, I just wanted to mention, besides what we'll be mentioning soon, which is the websites, another good place to figure this out, to start noticing professors, like where they are on the ladder of the professoriate, would be to look at your syllabi. So for those that are taking classes right now, take a look at your syllabi and see at the top of the syllabus on page 1, it should be near the top. It would say like assistant professor, lecturer, associate
Right.
professor. So
That's
just notice these things.
yeah, for current faculty. We'll talk again about how to find this information with, in fact, it's on the next slide. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, so regardless of whether you start with a top-down or a bottom-up approach, eventually you get to the program websites or department websites, and you really need to look at this for a lot of information. I'll jump ahead to one thing is looking at faculty profiles. Faculty profiles will generally list their job title, so they'll list whether they are an assistant professor, an associate professor, lecturer, et cetera, et cetera. So you should be looking through faculty profiles anyway as you start to decide who you think you might want to work with. Again, this is something we'll come back to in coming weeks, but like really being able to speak to who you would work with is an essential piece of any PhD program application. and one that we'll sort of really dive into over the next 2 weeks. But it's good to know sort of main research areas for an entire program. What this means is, what does it seem, what are some of the priorities that the department seems to be into? If they're really sort of, showcasing certain kinds of research, that means that they're probably really receptive to PhD students who are working in that kind of research. It doesn't mean they don't want folks doing other stuff. But if you happen to be doing the thing that they're like, oh man, we just started a new lab in cryptographic analysis of distributed networks, right? Then, we know at least one person in the call who maybe that's a program they would probably want to look into, because that's something that they're not only interested in it, they're clearly investing in sort of expanding research in that area. Um, yeah, but the biggest thing is faculty profiles and what their research areas are, especially if you're coming from a top-down approach. Um, Looking at the sort of different, they may offer different forms of PhDs, so they might have different emphases on different things, and that's something to look into and what those requirements are. And then again, this is more relative to next week, but really sort of getting the administrative side of what are the requirements for the application, but also what are the expectations once I get there? Is this something that I think makes sense for me, from an administrative milestone standpoint? Okay, next slide.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about websites so far, about faculty. Now we'll be sharing a bit about what other factors you might that might be worth considering when you're looking into PhD programs. So we have three different broad areas that we cover here on this slide. And those categories, broadly speaking, you could look into them, and they are PhD advisors and the research lab that the advisors are in, as well as the program, the department, or the institution that you're interested in, and the geographic location. So where are these institutions located? In terms of your PhD advisor or the research lab, just to give you all an example, research and publication activities or the opportunities for collaboration that these faculty members have, or how connected are they with the industries? Because you can use a PhD not only to become a professor, but also to work in different companies. So how connected are these faculty members to different industries in computing or in other areas? In terms of the program, department, or institution, some of the factors there might be what research opportunities exist, how much financial support is there? So in terms of funding that the university offers, that's what we mean by financial support. What is the academic culture like, broadly speaking, in the university itself, not only in the lab, but also in the university? And what types of collaborations can you have with other programs or other departments within the university? So looking more broadly outside of the lab space and into the university itself. And some of these considerations can be related to both your advisors and the lab that they're in, as well as to the program, department, or institution. So for example, looking at culture, broadly speaking, academic culture could fall into both of those categories. There's academic culture within the university space. It might be a great culture, and you never know, maybe the lab space may or may not be such a great culture. So that's these factors, again, it goes back to the idea we were saying before. These are not mutually exclusive. Some of these factors can fall into more than one category.
Real quick too, the thing about collaboration across university for some folks in this meeting, right? Uh, if you're doing something with psychology, are you in a computing PhD program working with folks in the psychology school, or are you in a psychology PhD but you want to work with some folks in the computing school? That can happen both ways. Often universities allow people to sit on committees in departments they don't belong to. And in fact, at certain milestones in some PhD programs, you're required to have someone who's external to your department. So if you're looking sort of at these collaborative relationships, that can make that requirement or that opportunity real easier or more difficult.
Right, and just another thing to keep in mind is also how much you might need to teach. So depending on how much funding is available within the lab, do you need to teach as a TA or not? And who would you like to work with? Who are other advisors besides your main advisor that you might work with from other programs? Yeah. And then the third area is more geographic location. So how much does it cost to live in these places? What are the politics like? Going back to the question of administration and research funding, what are the politics like within that particular region? What is the broader culture like outside of the university space? And what's the quality of life? What are you going to do outside of the lab space? How can you enjoy yourself? So it's really important that you take the time to learn as much as you can, and we share some more tips on the coming slides in terms of just how you can better gain a sense of whether or not the university is a good fit for you. So it's also important to keep in mind the current faculty mentors that you may have or your coaches to corroborate your ideas with them as well. And so here we give you all a few tips in terms of what you can do to start gathering some of the information that we just shared. So you can start by creating a wider net for your ideas. So you might start with a really broad list of ideas and start shortening them and start filtering them as you go into, you can prioritize the university. So what university would you definitely go to? Which one would you definitely not? And you can also do things like include programs across the different ranking or based off of their different reputations in order to start figuring out where you might want to go. And so in terms of how many, I applied to 6 PhD programs and 1 master's. I applied straight out of undergrad. That's my case. Other people I've heard that do way more schools or way less schools, but I'd really focus on the fit of the campus. It's also important to keep in mind to avoid programs where you would not go at all. So don't even put those on your list. If you don't see yourself going there, don't spend your time applying to them if you wouldn't go there at all. And just also keep in mind to make time to look up the programs within the shortlist. So as you start shortening your list and prioritizing it, start researching the programs that you're more interested in. Take more time to research those as you move farther along in the process. And I'll pass it to Dan.
Great. Yeah, I'll wrap it up and we should have a few minutes for just sort of general questions or any sort of follow-ups. Although real quick, I see how many is a manageable number of programs to apply to. Yeah, that's a sort of case by case question. It depends on how many other stuff you have going on, and also whether or not you apply for fee waivers. When I was applying for PhDs, um, like sometimes I would qualify for a fee waiver, sometimes I wouldn't. I didn't have a lot of money in the bank, so that sort of also limited how much I could submit applications. But I mean, I would say, yeah, the first year I applied to, I think 7. The second year, I think I applied to probably 5. The last year, I only applied to 2 programs because I was sort of kind of like, well, if I don't get in this year, I guess I'm not doing a PhD. And I sort of at that point decided, as I said earlier in the call, that these were going to be the best programs for what I wanted to do. So, I'll either get in there or I won't. I did get in, so it worked out. But yeah, so I think that unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that, right? I think you can reuse a lot of your materials. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the following week in terms of like what those materials entail. But you're not having to rewrite the application from scratch every time. So, I mean, that can mitigate sort of high volume applications. You do have to sort of tailor it, but um, you shouldn't be starting from scratch. Like you are who you are, and that's who the application is about. Um, so yeah. But yeah, so for on this slide, if we go to the next slide, yeah, great. So for next week, as I sort of perfect segue, we're going to be really sort of getting into now the sort of practical components of applying, right? The actual processes. And what we would say is anyone who's planning to attend next week, sort of think about start with thinking, I don't know why the one bullet's different. It must have messed something up. But start thinking about like 1 to 3 research areas or topics or questions that are the most interest to you and why. Um, what sort of sub areas or topics within those interests interest you the most. Um, why does that research matter to you? Why are you interested in it, right? And there's a lot of answers to that that have may have something to do with your personal experience, sort of your personal interest, your plans for the future, etc. But just the honest answer of like, why does it matter to you? And that can be a very sort of cynical, practical answer at a certain level. But being able to sort of understand why you're interested in that is a really valuable thing. Uh, Also thinking through why other people might care about that project becomes also increasingly important, which we'll talk about next week and the week following. Um, uh, and as that sort of segues also into what past experiences do you have that influence the motivation, not just the interest, right? And what past experiences have prepared you on a practical level to pursue those interests, right? Like if you have a psych background and suddenly you want to do, a PhD in painting, you're gonna have a harder sell. So you need to be able to speak to like it doesn't mean it's impossible. I know so a lot of people who sort of dramatically changed their disciplinary trajectories from undergrad to PhD. I was an anthropologist in an undergrad, and then I did a PhD in an information and computer science school. So you can do it, but you have to be able to very sort of clearly tell that story about why being a psychology major makes you such a good painting PhD student, right? That becomes a really important thing to think about. Um, and then thinking about what do you think the new thing you might learn or that others might learn from the research that you hope to do. All right. Yeah. So again, those are some really key things to start thinking about because it starts to get you to the content of your application materials, which will be sort of really sort of walking through in the following week or 2 weeks. Yeah, you can go to the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah, essentially done.
Just
Um,
go.
So yeah, we do value your feedback, and we try to sort of respond to how people sort of experience these workshops, sort of as we kind of progress through them. We got some really great feedback last week that really helped us sort of shape this workshop, and we'll continue sort of trying to best serve the sort of needs and priorities of the people who attend. So if you can sort of respond to this, it's great. It's only 5 questions, as it says, takes just a couple of minutes. Um, but with that, yeah, and the last few minutes, if anyone's got some sort of still burning questions about anything we covered or, anything else sort of related to what we talked about, um, you can also sort of find the CRA and UR2 PhD information on these sites. I'm also going to drop my email in here because I do realize that we forgot to put our contact information on slides this week. Last week we did. But if you have any other also follow-up questions, perfectly happy to answer that. Especially, you had Kyla, you had the one question about outside the US. I can sort of give you some quick answers of how that differs from US programs because they are different. Um, a lot of stuff is the same, but there are some sort of key function structural differences.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, of course. That's what we're here for. Yeah, no problem.
Hope you all have a great rest of your day or evening, wherever you are.
Yeah, Anthony, go ahead. Thank you, Robert.
For sure. Anthony, if you'd like to ask, feel free.
Uh, Even if you're just typing it, that's fine. Take your
Or
time.
yeah, exactly.
Oh, there we go.
So
Smell binding.
I'm just gonna read.
Yeah, go for it. So there's sneaky ways. I mean, networking is often the best way. If you don't feel you can rely on the sort of publicly available information on their website, or in the case of my PhD program, they just hadn't updated the website in a while. So they weren't trying to be sort of deceptive or market themselves in a sort of sneaky way. They just hadn't updated the website in a while. So there was actually out of date information that I only found out because the sort of answer to my question is start reaching out to the people you're interested in. Um, this is something we'll actually talk about next week in particular, when you first and in the next week and the following week as well, in terms of like the importance of actually sort of reaching out to folks in the department, both on the faculty side to sort of help you be able to say in your application that like this person might actually be willing to work with you. Um, you're not committing to them to it. Obviously, they have that decision, but you can sort of suggest that that conversation has occurred because hopefully it has. Um, but they're humans first, and then generally you'll have a conversation with them. It doesn't have to be like networking, like like we see in sort of weird sort of movies. Remember that's just a conversation. But also the other sort of one is reaching out to current PhD students to sort of have conversations about strengths and weaknesses, both sort of from a programmatic standpoint or from a research standpoint. Um,
Or
but
it could
yeah,
also be helpful to look at alumni too. So
yeah,
like recent alum who graduated like
what are they
maybe
doing?
up to 5 years. What are they doing after they finished at the program?
Yeah, absolutely. The website will give you, sometimes that can be hard to track down, but there's a couple ways you can do it. I mean, the website will usually list prominent alumni. They don't always, sort of to your point, they don't always list everybody. Um, but you can, there's a couple different ways I mean, I'm trying to think because there's a couple different ways to do it, but um, yeah, I'm not thinking of the best way off the top of my head. But yeah, I
Or
would say
even
the
looking
bit.
at like other parts of the university, so like the career center or like what support is there, and we'll be going into more of that next week too in terms of like outside of the lab, what can you get from a university? But those could also be good people to look into too, because you're not only going to be in a lab for 8 hours a day, you need to like find other things to occupy you. So it's important to look at other resources that the universities offer too.
That's actually a couple weeks away. Next week, we're gonna
Yeah,
be covering some
no,
more specific
fair.
stuff, but that's okay. We will be covering it, just not quite next week. But yeah, I mean, there's no easy answer. It really sort of depends on the department. Some departments, as you sort of suggest, are sort of more open and transparent than others. But at the end of the day, I think the probably best answer is just try to reach out to folks in the department, particularly ones that you're hoping to work with anyway, because you're going to want to reach out to them anyway. Um, and at the end of the day, to some of the topics we talked about last week, this is you have to think about this as applying for a job in many ways rather than a more school. And if your advisor is simultaneously your sort of supervisor, but also like your parent in a weird way, they have a sort of motivation to be fairly transparent because they don't if they lie to you and then you show up and things are different, then that relationship is immediately not going to go very well. So I find that most folks looking for PhD students, as someone who looks for PhD students myself, I'm in a position where I take on PhD students. Um, there's no benefit to me to sort of try to oversell or distort the experience of working with myself or in my program. That's not going to benefit anybody, least of all myself. So, yeah, that would be my best advice. And that's sort of networking, but it's also sort of part of the application process in a way that we'll talk about next week. Hopefully that's helpful. Great. Thanks so much,
Thanks for
Anthony.
coming.
Yep. See you later.